Hello and welcome to How to See Spiritually, a series with me, Mark Vernon, on intuition and the eye of the soul. For more, do visit my website, markvernon.com, and if you like the films, please pass them around and feel free to make comments. I wanted to begin by why I think this issue of spirituality really matters. And basically, I think it does because it's an implicit part of what it is to be human, and yet in the modern world we've become radically detached from it. You see it in mental health. I work as a psychotherapist, and there's often a profound sense that underneath all the immediate problems which people face, and which are real and are often clinically defined, there's a sense of uncoupling, or a sense of being human that is like being a machine, as if there's a pill or a technique that can somehow reprogram and sort all things out. There's very little sense of journey into what might be causing an upset, and that is part of what it is to be spiritual. I think you see it in churches too. I've had a lot to do with the church over the years, particularly the Church of England, and whilst the churches are tremendous at things like social concern, at moral values, it's very hard actually to find a church which will really lead you into a spiritual sense of things, the spiritual depth. Churches will lead you to the threshold by going to a wonderful service or entering an impressive building. But there aren't really the adepts who somehow you feel have gone there themselves and might invite you or show you the way to engage with these things further. And then also I think we see it in relation to the environment. This perhaps is the most obvious, that we've treated the environment like a machine, like a resource, and we've become very uncoupled from the felt sense of relationship with the natural world, like we want to actually belong in it, to feel its energies and its vitality, the spirituality of the natural world. And so we don't really know quite how to reform the way that we live. And because we're not being drawn, we try and work it out morally, but we don't really somehow sense what this might really be to be rooted in the natural world and relate to it, as I think our forebears in the medieval, in the ancient world, did really quite naturally and spontaneously. So that's something about why I think spirituality really matters and reaches over quite a wide range of issues that we face, and why we need to develop a perception that works at the spiritual level, as well as the perception at the material level, which we have in abundance and delivers many great goods. What is the spiritual? I know part of this issue that often comes up is, what is spirituality? What is the spiritual? Well, broadly speaking, I borrow ideas from the ancient Greek world, which have very much formed and shaped my sense of things. And they had an idea that the spiritual is on a kind of continuum of being. At one end is the empirical, is the material, that which you can touch, the physical side of things, the side that modern science gets to grips with so very well. But that's just one side of it. And within the material world is the sense of its vitality, its livedness, its soul would be the traditional word. Anima is the Latin, anima for animate, that which gives it a sense of aliveness. We're beginning to get more into the spiritual zone there. And then a next step along this hierarchy of being would be the spirit itself, that which somehow underpins all things, of which we're just like a node in the network, or we're one expression of. But somehow we can gain a sense of being deeply connected with the life that's all around us at this spiritual level. So I think spirituality is about trying to open up a perception of this deeper pulse of life, so that we don't just feel ourselves to be operating at the material level, but through that feel an innate soulfulness, and words like soul make sense to us once more. And then even further on from that, the sense of spirit, that somehow our lives are part of a much broader life. Our consciousness, our awareness is part of a much deeper consciousness and awareness that runs through all things. This again was a sense of the spiritual that many peoples have shared over long periods of time, and it's only really quite recently that we've become cut off from it. So it's worth asking, why we've become cut off from it. Is there a story that can help us to understand that and begin to build a bit of context that can then be used to develop a sense of perceiving spiritually once again? I've been very influenced by a chap called Owen Barfield in this. He was one of the Inklings. He was very influential on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, his two most famous members of the two most famous members of the Inklings as well. They said, Lewis and Tolkien said, that Barfield actually had the best ideas, and they were able to turn it into great works of literature and philosophy. But Barfield had a core idea, which I think really helps us to understand how we've got to where we've got to, and begins to open up how we might see spiritually once again. He thought that human consciousness evolves. It changes over time. Not a Darwinian evolution over many millions of years, and for human consciousness over hundreds of thousands of years. That no doubt occurs. The brain has to develop in certain ways and so on. But he thought that our experience of what it is to be human has evolved in a shorter period of time, and particularly over about the last 3,000 years or so. When you look at writers like Homer, for example, writer of the Iliad, the Odyssey, there's clearly a very different perception of life going on. When Achilles attacks Agamemnon, for example, he doesn't decide to do so. He's influenced by the gods. And when he stops, Athena, the god Athena, literally appears in the Iliad and pulls back his head and stops him doing it. This is a very different perception of what it is to be human, much more fated. Sometimes it's said a bit like the puppets of the gods. I think that's going a bit too far, but something like that, like being chess pieces being moved around. You get this original participation, as Barfield called it, this very immersive sense of participating in life. When you see material objects from the ancient Egyptian world, go into any great museum, go into the Egyptian gallery, stand before the figures there, and you'll immediately get a sense that this was a very, very different consciousness, a very, very different experience of what it was to be human, that both informed the making of the object and perhaps is also called up from within you as you stand before it. The pyramids themselves, it's now known that they weren't built by slaves. They were built by people that felt they were taking part in the key activity of the society at the time in the early Egyptian period. And pyramids then were external objects that were built at the pinnacle, as it were, perhaps was the pharaoh, was the deity, the divine presence, and then as the pyramid moves down to its base, there's the sense of more people, their place in society. It's an external manifestation of how they would have felt. Spirituality was, as it were, as explicit to them as the pyramid is to us now. We tend to internalize pyramids now. We'll think about our needs, for example, and at the base of the pyramid are our basic needs for security, for food, for water. And then as you rise up the pyramid, you come to higher needs like the need for education, friendship, love, and then maybe at the top there's the need for self-actualization, more spiritual concerns. So we have a kind of internal pyramid, whereas I think in this earlier experience of what it was to be human, there was quite literally external pyramids that told you about your place and that you contributed to in the building of society. That was this original participation in Barfield's schema. It makes sense of magic too. If the life force comes to you from the outside in, then magic works, because you can take a part of your body, for example, a bit of hair, and influence someone externally that way. There's a much more porous sense of what it is to be human. So magic is a very common feature of these ancient societies. You can look at other facets too. And for example, body parts are seen to have a kind of vitality all of their own. There's not a gathered sense of the individual, such as we have, because there's not a gathered sense of inner life that then, as it were, speaks outward from the individual. Instead, your body parts were kind of gathered vitalities, gathered spirited entities that moved around, and you would have related to yourself by relating to the deities that were to do with the particular body part. And the Eye of Horus is one of the best known examples of that. Your eye, as it were, had a life of its own that you had to learn how to relate to in this earlier experience of consciousness. So it's a spirit of consciousness where life moves from the outside in. There's not such a keen sense of what's me and not me. Between mortals and immortals, there's a kind of flow of meaning, a flow of life. And that changes, Barfield argued, that changes. There's a kind of step back from this immersion, and a gap opens up. And that gap is both a great blessing, but also a great challenge. It's a blessing because a sense of the individual can really begin to form. You see this in the move from the Egyptian period into the Greek period. The ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates, like Plato and so on, I think that they still speak to us now because they begin to formulate the sense of what it is to be an individual, and ask the questions of meaning that are still our own, ones you don't find in Homer, for example, or in ancient Egypt. The problem then wasn't what's the meaning of life. The problem then was there was just a flow of meaning continuously that you had to navigate your way through. So this gap opens up between us and the external world, which has the upside that we begin to get a sense of our own inner life, being able to find our way, make decisions. Things like free will and conscience start to be talked about at this time. But it also creates a problem because you have the problem of how we're going to relate to this external world that's slightly distanced from us now. And so questions of spirituality start to become really important about this time. And that, in a way, is still our predicament now, our challenge now. I think it's taken an extra twist in the modern world around the time of the Enlightenment, around the time of the scientific revolution, where the world didn't just seem to be slightly separate and distant from us, that we had to somehow reach out to it and learn to relate to it through ritual, through religious techniques and so on, through spiritual trainings, which people in the medieval world underwent. With the material world, we've even got the idea that the universe is like a mechanism that actually has no inner life. It has no implicit inner meaning. This model has been very successful in many ways. It's given us technology and many comforts and secure features of modern life. But it's left us with the sense that we're not sure how to connect with it once again. And we've kind of lost that innate sense that there is a meaning to connect to. We're not sure about that anymore. And with it goes the wisdom about how to really develop that sense, the wisdom that would have been held in the great spiritual traditions, be it the monasteries and religious houses in other parts of the world in different contexts. I actually think that psychotherapy has arisen in the modern world to try and fill this gap. This vacuum. We want to work on our inner lives again, aren't quite sure how to do that, and often find ourselves stumbling over pathologies and so on in the effort to do so. But nonetheless, this is our challenge. This is how we become perhaps cut off from spiritual perception through this great evolution of consciousness from a time about 3,000 years ago when it really wasn't an issue. Spirits and gods were felt to be all around. Nature was felt to be alive. We've come through these various stages of stepping back, with the bonus that brings of individuality, being able to study the world more objectively, but also with this great challenge that we need to know how to perceive spiritually once more, how to engage with the inner life of all things, and not just work on the assumption that the only inner life is the inner life inside our heads. So we need a new approach, and that's what I'm going to try and talk about in this series. It needs to be non-regressive. There's quite a lot of that around these days, and by that I mean the sense that we, as it were, give up on our ego, we give up on our individuality and sink into a kind of oceanic bliss, whether it be through meditation techniques, whether it be through the use of drugs, psychedelics. That can give us a sense that there's more than just me, for sure. But I think it's also infantilizing ultimately, because it just leaves you sort of at the whim or blissed out in this experience. In psychotherapy, you talk about it being regressive. Freud, for example, thought that a lot of spiritual experience was a kind of desire to return to a kind of childish state where you're held and fed and nurtured and everything feels like it's one. I think he was wrong to think the whole of spiritual life is like that, but he was picking up on one part of it, which is this regressive tendency that you can see quite a lot of. But also I think we need to avoid another kind of extreme, which is the extreme that goes to ecstasies, that seeks just one peak experience after another. I'm going to try in this series to point to a kind of in-between way of approaching these things, that's not reaching out for a kind of loss of self, but also is not reaching out for one ecstatic experience after another, but that the spiritual sense can steady down and it can be lived with more and more day by day. It's quieter, but nonetheless it's more sustaining. It's sometimes not so spectacular, and yet actually it grounds you in life a lot more. That's what I'm going to be trying to go for in thinking about how to see spiritually once again, and I hope to unfold over this series.